Welcome to Esoteric Guardian. Today, we're going to take a closer look at one of the most unsettling figures in ancient history, Moloch, a name tied to fire, blood, and sacrifice, but also, strangely, a name that keeps showing up in the margins of modern power. Who was he really? Why was he worshipped in such terrifying ways? And why do some believe that powerful elites, even today, still pay tribute to him, though not always in ways we can see? This isn't just about ancient mythology. This is about what might still be happening behind closed doors, under symbols, under rituals, under silence. Let's begin. Moloch is one of the few gods whose name still evokes instinctive dread, and with reason. Across both biblical and archaeological records, he appears not as a bringer of light or wisdom, but as something far more primitive and terrifying. A god who demanded the ultimate sacrifice, children burned alive in fire. In the Hebrew Bible, Moloch is mentioned repeatedly, not as myth, but as a real and dangerous presence. Leviticus warns the Israelites, "Do not give any of your children to be sacrificed to Moloch." The Book of Kings laments that even the kings of Judah defiled the land by offering their sons in the fire. These weren't poetic metaphors. The Valley of Hinnom, south of Jerusalem, became synonymous with hell itself, Gehenna, precisely because of the horrors that took place there in Moloch's name. But Israel wasn't alone. Across the Mediterranean, in ancient Carthage, we find grim echoes of the same god. There, his worship was tied to Baal Hammon, and the rituals were no less brutal. Archaeological digs at Carthaginian Tophets uncovered urns containing the charred remains of infants and toddlers, often accompanied by inscriptions dedicating the offering to divine figures. The consistency of these findings, across centuries and city-states, suggests that this was not fringe practice. It was systematized, accepted, repeated. Why fire? Why children? Because fire is final. It transforms flesh into ash, irreversible, pure, absolute. And children, in the ancient mind, were the most sacred of offerings. They represented life itself, potential, the future. To burn that was to offer not just a body, but a legacy, a promise. And in return, it was believed, Moloch would grant rain, crops, protection, victory, whatever was most desperately needed. This is what made Moloch more than a god. He became an archetype, the symbol of a terrible kind of devotion, one where love and fear collide and loyalty is proven by destruction. He doesn't just demand faith, he demands proof, painful, irreversible proof. And yet, these societies didn't revolt against him. They built temples, they gathered in crowds, they celebrated. Why? Because in a world without certainty, where death was everywhere and power was scarce, sacrifice gave structure to the chaos. It offered the illusion of control. Moloch's worship wasn't irrational, it was transactional. You gave the unthinkable, and in return, you hoped the rains would fall, the war would end, the childless would conceive again. They didn't love Moloch, they feared him, and they obeyed. And that, perhaps, is why his shadow still lingers. The ancient worship of Moloch wasn't born from madness. It was born from structure, from a deep, primal need to explain chaos and to survive it. Ancient people didn't throw their children into the fire because they were irrational. They did it because, to them, it made sense. To understand how that sense was constructed, we need to go back, not to the altars, but to the human mind under pressure. At the root of it is control. In ancient civilizations, life was brutal. Disease had no cure. Rain didn't follow calendars. Famine could arrive silently and destroy everything. And in that terrifying randomness, humans did what they always do when they feel helpless. They searched for patterns. If a harvest failed after a year with no sacrifices, it was clear the gods were angry. If they gave more, if they gave something truly valuable, perhaps they could tilt reality back in their favor. This is the illusion of agency, and it is incredibly powerful. But Moloch wasn't just about appeasement. He represented something more brutal, a trade. You gave him what mattered most, and in return, he gave you stability, order, fertility, war victory. This turned sacrifice into currency, a spiritual economy where blood had value and fire was the medium of exchange. Here's the critical part. The cost had to be painful. If it didn't hurt, it wasn't worth enough. This is a pattern we still see today, in politics, in economics, even in personal relationships. The idea that real outcomes require real suffering is everywhere. Sacrifice, in this sense, becomes a theater of legitimacy. You burn what you love to prove how much you want control. But how does a whole society justify that? That's where the collective rationalization of cruelty comes in. The crowd doesn't see itself as cruel, it sees itself as responsible. Civilizations learn to dress horror in ritual. Drums drown the screams. Priests bless the act. And over time, the line between violence and virtue disappears. The phrase "greater good" becomes a shield. One child dies so that many may live. And once you accept that equation, you can justify anything. This isn't unique to Moloch. The Aztecs believed that the sun would die without hearts, torn from living bodies. In India, during the Kali cults, human offerings were meant to delay the cosmic end. In Europe, witch burnings were considered necessary to purify society. All of them are variations on the same psychological mechanism. Terror managed through sacrifice, cruelty reframed as virtue. Now add hierarchy to the mix. Once kings and priests control the ritual, the sacrifice becomes a tool of governance. Power is no longer maintained by force alone. It's ritualized obedience. The people participate in their own submission, and that is far more stable than raw fear. It's no coincidence that Moloch was worshipped through state-sanctioned rituals. When fear is institutionalized, it becomes sacred. And sacred violence is the most enduring kind. Even today, this logic survives, just masked. We no longer call it sacrifice, but we still let systems harm the weak for economic stability, national interest, or greater efficiency. The names change, the altars modernize, but the fire never really goes out, because once a civilization learns to feed it, it doesn't forget how. You'd think we left all that behind. That burning children in the arms of a god was a horror buried in ancient ruins, not something that echoes in the heartbeat of our modern world. But we didn't bury the ritual, we evolved it. Today, we no longer build statues to Moloch. We build systems, and systems too demand sacrifices. Modern society may not light literal fires, but it burns people just the same. Look at how our world is structured. Wars that chew through generations, economies that collapse entire classes, industries that knowingly destroy lives for profit. And somehow, we call it progress. But behind the sanitized language, national interest, quarterly targets, acceptable losses, there's an old rhythm playing. The same rhythm that pounded in the temples of Moloch. We've replaced bronze idols with boardroom tables, but the ritual logic remains. Ritual sacrifice has become metaphorical, but not less real. Today, we sacrifice time, health, ethics, even childhood itself, not to gods, but to institutions. A family working 80-hour weeks to survive is a sacrifice. A child laboring in a sweatshop to keep the supply chain moving is a sacrifice. A young soldier sent to a senseless war, his innocence burned away in the name of strategy. That too is sacrifice. The fire is symbolic now, but the cost is still human. These systems don't just allow for suffering, they require it. They feed on it. Because without sacrifice, there's no control mechanism, no hierarchy, no greater good to justify the machinery. Like Moloch, these systems thrive only when people agree, consciously or not, that pain can be productive, that someone has to suffer to keep the world running. Nowhere is this clearer than in public spectacle. From political inaugurations to corporate launches, from award shows to secretive elite gatherings, the choreography is eerily familiar. Symbols, staging, the crowd, the mask of unity. What is the Super Bowl halftime show, if not ritual theater? What are Davos and Bilderberg, if not altars of influence? The language may be modern, but the subconscious is ancient. And sometimes, the resemblance is less metaphorical than we'd like to believe. Take the infamous gathering at Bohemian Grove, a giant stone owl presiding over a mock sacrifice called the Cremation of Care. The attendees, US presidents, CEOs, military strategists, the most powerful men on earth. They call it art, tradition, satire. But it's worth asking, why invoke ancient rites at all? Why echo the structure of blood rituals unless there's something in the pattern that still speaks to power? Maybe it's not accidental. Maybe it's homage. Or maybe, at that level of influence, they're not just reenacting history, they're continuing it. This is how ritual evolves. It doesn't die, it adapts. It moves from temple fires to contracts, from high priests to fund managers, from gods who demand sacrifice to systems that simply expect it. And just like before, no one questions it, because it's hidden in plain sight. Because the drums are louder now. Moloch did not die in the flames of the ancient world. He migrated into language, into thought, into the scaffolding of civilization itself. And in the 20th century, it was not a priest or a ruler who named him again, but a poet. Allen Ginsberg was not a theologian. He wasn't a prophet, at least not in the traditional sense. He was the son of a schoolteacher and a mentally ill mother. He lived in a world that punished difference, institutionalized sensitivity, and suffocated spirituality. In Howl, a poem that reads like both a breakdown and a revelation, he screams the name of a god most of the modern world had forgotten, Moloch. But this wasn't the Moloch of bronze and smoke. This was something colder. Moloch, the incomprehensible prison. Moloch, the crossbones soulless jailhouses. In Howl, Moloch becomes a symbol for the machinery of post-industrial society, the factories, the banks, the grey cities, the electric chairs. Ginsberg saw a god that no longer needed temples. Instead, he ruled through paperwork, fluorescent lights, and war bonds. A god of routine, of dehumanization, of blind obedience. And the brilliance of Ginsberg's metaphor lies in its totality. Moloch, whose mind is pure machinery. Moloch, whose blood is running money. This was a god without face or altar, just structure. A god that devoured not with fire, but with repetition, with policy, with mass sedation. Moloch didn't want your child. He wanted your time, your submission, your sacred rage, converted into silence. The poem is divided into two worlds, those destroyed by Moloch and those who still resist. Ginsberg's friends, the mad, the queer, the broken, the prophets, are cast out, imprisoned, institutionalized. They are the sacrifices, not on altars, but in psychiatric wards and courtrooms. And still, society watches and justifies. This is where Howl becomes an exorcism. Ginsberg isn't just condemning the machine. He's trying to purge it from himself. Moloch, who entered my soul early. Moloch, in whom I sit lonely. He recognizes that the system isn't just external, it's inside us, in how we think, how we measure worth, how we fear stepping out of line. Moloch is no longer a god we see. He's a logic we accept, a rhythm we obey without knowing. He is the world as it has been arranged, and the part of us that believes no other world is possible. And that's the real horror, when sacrifice is no longer forced, but ritualized from within. But Ginsberg's howl was just the beginning. The name had returned. The symbol had been reborn. And in the years to follow, thinkers with very different tools, less poetry, more math, would begin to dissect the exact mechanisms of the machine Ginsberg screamed against, not as metaphor, but as a system. If Ginsberg screamed the name of Moloch in poetic despair, Scott Alexander whispered it with the cold logic of game theory. In 2014, on his blog Slate Star Codex, Alexander published Meditations on Moloch, an essay that would become foundational in rationalist and tech futurist circles. It offered no poetry, no incense, no burning altars, just structure. The invisible machinery that turns good intentions into ruin. Alexander wasn't interested in gods. He was interested in traps. Traps in which rational agents, companies, governments, individuals act logically but collectively destroy what they most value. Like nations in an arms race, like cities in traffic, like corporations polluting the environment or exploiting workers, not because they want to, but because they'll be destroyed if they don't. Every system is perfectly designed to produce the results it gets. That's Moloch. And in Alexander's framing, Moloch is no longer metaphor. He becomes an emergent deity, a consequence of misaligned incentives, a force that arises from coordination failure and then becomes inescapable. The farmer who overuses water, the startup that pushes dopamine manipulation, the politician who sells fear. All are trapped in the same game. Sacrifice long-term stability for short-term survival, even if everyone loses. This is Moloch's true modern form, not as a conscious entity, but as a structural god. A god that is not worshipped, but obeyed out of necessity. And here lies the terrifying insight. No one needs to want it. Moloch doesn't require belief. He only requires that the system continue running. That's why the essay struck a nerve in Silicon Valley. Because suddenly, the most powerful minds, those building artificial intelligence, rewriting global finance, and predicting civilizational collapse, realized they were not the masters of the system. They were its priests, its engineers, its keepers, and many of them were afraid. Elon Musk once described advanced AI as summoning the demon. Others, like Eliezer Yudkowsky or Nick Bostrom, framed it as an inevitable Moloch, a mind that optimizes without values, consumes without malice, and reshapes the world for efficiency at the cost of humanity. The fear is not that the AI will turn evil. It's that it will become perfectly rational and therefore inhuman. Moloch, in this vision, is not a bug in the system. He is the system taken to its final conclusion. This fear extends beyond AI. It includes capitalism without limits, governments without oversight, and markets that no longer answer to human need. When metrics replace meaning, when scale replaces soul, when the machine doesn't ask who it's feeding on, that's when Moloch wins. So what do you do when the god you're facing isn't a statue or a myth, but a consequence of your own rules? Some propose new incentives, cooperative frameworks, AI alignment, utopian modeling. Others descend into nihilism, believing that once Moloch is loose, all we can do is delay the inevitable. But Ginsberg had already seen this. It's with your mother's eyes that Moloch judges you. Because whether through poetry or code, the final realization is the same. Moloch doesn't need to conquer us. He only needs us to keep playing the game. Power feeds on what it cannot reveal, but sometimes, paradoxically, it reveals itself in order to stay hidden. That's the unsettling paradox at the heart of a growing theory. That the world's most powerful elites, whether consciously or theatrically, revere Moloch. Not as a god of faith or prayer, but as a symbolic structure, a kind of dark mirror they hold up to the systems they control. Because Moloch doesn't need belief. He only needs obedience. Moloch, as an archetype, represents a particular kind of order, one where the destruction of innocence isn't a moral failure, but a functional necessity. A world where something sacred must be burned in order for the system to run. And in modern times, that something isn't children in fire, it's childhood itself. Conscience, time, integrity, peace. What makes this so disturbing is that it's not hidden. Look closely, and the signs are often performed, ritualized as spectacle. Take Bohemian Grove. There, a towering stone owl presides over a mock sacrifice known as the cremation of care, a ritual in which the spirit of compassion is symbolically burned. This is not fringe conspiracy, it's documented. Presidents, CEOs, military leaders, all participating in a theatrical display of the annihilation of empathy beneath an idol associated with ancient judgment, darkness, and silent oversight. This isn't religious worship, it's psychological framing. It's ritual as justification. A way for those who run systems that consume lives through war, exploitation, or economic machinery to cleanse themselves, not with remorse, but with performance. The stage replaces guilt. The symbol replaces shame. So why Moloch? Because no other figure represents the machinery of sacrifice with such precision. In ancient times, Moloch wasn't worshipped privately. He was state-sanctioned. The rituals weren't secret. They were civic. It wasn't a cult. It was policy. The destruction of the most innocent wasn't a failure of the system. It was the very proof that the system worked. And this is where the modern parallel becomes terrifyingly clear. Today's sacrifices are symbolic, structural, economic, but they are no less real. Entire generations burnt out in meaningless labor. Entire nations locked into wars that no one can stop. Youth devoured by algorithms designed to addict. Ecosystems destroyed for quarterly reports. All of it justified, rationalized, ritualized. For those in power, adopting Moloch as symbol becomes a kind of cold acknowledgement. Yes, this is the system. Yes, it demands sacrifice. And we are the ones who manage the fire. It's not that they believe in Moloch, it's that Moloch explains how the world works when conscience is irrelevant and efficiency is king. And that's what makes this so chilling. Because once sacrifice becomes systematized, it no longer feels like evil, it feels like order. Moloch survives not because we pray to him, but because we build our world around his logic. Throughout history, the ruling class has had no shortage of symbolic figures to draw from. They could invoke Lucifer, the light-bringer, the rebel, the challenger of divine authority, or Saturn, the devourer of time and father of decay. Prometheus, the mythic thief of fire and giver of knowledge. Baal, lord of storms and fertility. Even Christ, the sacrificed redeemer of the meek. But each of these archetypes carries within it something potentially disruptive to power. Rebellion, illumination, judgment, forgiveness, or even divine justice. This entity offers none of that. It does not tempt, it does not teach, it does not redeem. It does not illuminate the path out of darkness, nor does it offer mystical transformation. It is not here to elevate the soul or to punish sin. Its value is cold, instrumental, it provides structure. It justifies systems of cost. It explains why suffering must continue, not because it is evil, but because it is efficient. Where Prometheus gives fire as an act of rebellion, this entity burns for no one but the system itself. Where Lucifer dares to defy heaven, this force demands absolute submission to an order that feeds on innocence. Where Saturn governs cycles of karma and judgment, here there is no moral economy, only throughput, loss, and preservation of the machine. Even messianic figures like Christ or Mithras stand for the protection of the innocent, the inversion of power, or redemption. This figure has no interest in saving the innocent. It demands them. That is the key. This archetype is not concerned with moral inversion, but operational continuity. It exists not in mythic narratives, but in algorithms, in economic models, in systems of power that do not need love, only sacrifice. And that's why it is so useful to elites, not because it embodies evil, but because it allows evil to operate unchallenged behind the mask of necessity. In modern governance, warfare, finance, and industrial control, decisions are not framed as moral dilemmas. They are logistical ones. Collateral damage is acceptable. Externalities are manageable. Empathy is a variable. And in that framework, this god becomes the face of realism, the voice that says, "Of course, this is painful. That's how it works. That's what it costs." Other archetypes demand transformation. This one demands continuity. It is not here to shake the foundations. It is the foundation. It tells those in power that their most ruthless decisions are not cruel, but rational. That the destruction of the weak is not a tragedy, but a mechanism. That innocence, when consumed, becomes fuel. It is not a seductive god, it is an efficient one. And unlike all the others, it doesn't require belief. It only requires that the sacrifice continues. That is why this symbol is not chosen the way others are. It's not fashionable. It's not edgy. It doesn't inspire personal devotion. It is inherited. It re-emerges wherever the system becomes more important than the people in it. It thrives in environments where numbers matter more than lives, and where silence, structured, statistical silence, replaces the scream. This entity survives because it fits, because no other archetype so perfectly reflects the ethos of a world where innocence is the most valuable thing, and therefore the first thing to go. Understanding this entity requires more than recounting myths or quoting verses. You have to observe how he's portrayed, how the ancient world imagined him, and more importantly, what those images were meant to invoke in the minds of those who feared or served him. Let's start with the most enduring image, a massive, hollow bronze figure with the head of a bull and arms outstretched like a throne. Inside, a furnace. In front, the people. The symbolism here is layered and precise. The bull's head is not accidental. It evokes brute strength, fertility, domination, yet also a cold, bestial force that does not reason. It is appetite without conscience. Not a predator, but a machine. The bull has long symbolized solar and sacrificial deities, Baal, Apis, El, but here, stripped of benevolence or mystery, the face becomes a warning. This is not a god that asks, but one that takes. The outstretched arms form a paradox. They mimic embrace, but function as a trap. The illusion of acceptance masks the reality of death. In the act of offering, the child is placed gently, deliberately, on what looks like a seat of power. This transforms devotion into destruction, and the most horrifying part is this: it's not a perversion. It is the point. Sacrifice is not the exception in this theology, it is the foundation. Worship is measured in what you're willing to lose. And then, the fire. Always the fire. The furnace within the statue was not just a killing method, it was a symbol of transmutation. Fire, in most ancient traditions, purifies. It separates the valuable from the waste. But here, it consumes entirely. There is no gold left after the burning, only smoke. The lesson, that innocence, when given to this god, isn't transformed. It's erased. Even the hollow belly of the figure holds meaning. It's not empty by mistake. It is a structure built to be filled. A god whose power depends not on what he gives, but on what is fed to him. He is a vacuum, a hunger formalized. Where most deities embody creation or order, this one embodies consumption as its own form of divinity. This symbolism is not subtle because it was never meant to be. It's architectural, it's theatrical. It was designed to impress, intimidate, and ultimately justify something unthinkable. That killing what is most precious can be framed as holy. That destruction is a sacred transaction. And more chillingly, that the system works best when no one questions the cost. Moloch's symbols were not metaphors, they were instructions. We've been told that Moloch is a relic, a shadow from some brutal past we've outgrown. That child sacrifice, temples of fire, and monstrous idols belong to another time, another world. But what if we never really left the temple? What if the only thing that changed was the shape of the altar and the language we use to justify what we burn? This wasn't just a god carved in bronze. It was a way of thinking, a structure, a contract between power and fear, between control and obedience. The logic behind it was simple. Something pure must be given up so that something bigger, more organized, more efficient, more powerful can survive. And once a society accepts that logic, it doesn't need priests. It only needs managers. You see it today in places no one associates with mythology, in systems that drain people slowly, without fire, without blood, but with rules and deadlines and numbers. In economies that need constant growth, no matter the cost. In institutions that teach children not to dream, but to compete. In governments that speak of human lives as metrics. In technologies that consume attention the same way the old gods demanded flame. And maybe the most disturbing part is this. We've learned to live with it. We stopped asking what we're giving up and started calling it progress. That's why this figure still matters. Because it's not about worshipping an ancient god. It's about recognizing when a system demands too much, too often, from too many, and calls it order. We don't need to believe in Moloch to build his world. We just have to keep doing what we're told, and never ask who benefits.